hello again from WJ Live, powered by the Western Journal. I'm Josh Manning, Deputy Managing Editor for Assignment at the Western Journal. Joining me today, Andrew Shasha is in charge of our Supervising Editor for Features. That's it, Supervising Editor for Features. And the newly minted Olivia Brown, a junior assignment editor who has just joined the team last week. Haven't even done a full. This is 5 days. This is day 5. This is exciting. She's about to have a week under her belt. So they're joining us today. Thank you for joining us. We appreciate it. There is a lot going on today. We've got 3 things in particular we want to talk with you about. We'll be talking a little bit about systemic racism and police violence. I should say so-called systemic racism. Famed civil rights attorney Leo Terrell got into it with Geraldo Rivera on Fox. We've got video of that. That's going to be fun to watch. There's actually a little bit of shouting involved. We're also going to be talking about big tech. And there are actually some liberal app makers out there who are really beginning to be afraid of big tech and Apple specifically and what they're doing. Olivia's going to talk with us about that. And then Andrew had the chance to sit down with famed Christian apologist Lee Strobel. That was late last week, I think. And had a fantastic interview with Lee. We're going to be talking specifically about revival in America and what's happening to the churched and the unchurched here. And we're going to see a clip or two from Lee, and we're going to talk about the future of Christianity and the future of America itself. But starting off, we're going to go over to systemic racism, systematic racism. That is the thing that's in vogue when you look at what the media talks about, when you look at what academia talks about and the left talks about. They kind of go in spurts, and you can see where the narrative changes. When the narrative changes, the language changes. And we see the word equity a whole lot and recently, and we see systemic racism a lot. And we've seen that a whole lot recently. And the reason systemic racism is useful for the left is you don't have to be trying to be racist for systemic racism to come into play. Systemic racism is a magical thing where racism simply appears anytime there is a statistical discrepancy between groups when you look at the groups by color or by race. So on Fox News yesterday, Leo Terrell, who's a famous, very, very well-known civil rights attorney. He's actually specialized in police abuse cases over the years. This guy is not a super conservative,
not at all.
Ultra right-wing, anything. This guy is reasoned, and he has been plugged in with the civil rights movement for a long time. He was, Harris Faulkner was interviewing him as well as Geraldo Rivera. They were talking about systemic racism and police brutality. We've got 2 or 3 clips from this. I want to run the first one, and it is Terrell talking a little bit about his, sort of his take on the police and systemic racism. Let's run clip 1, please.
Make my comments based on 30 years of being a civil rights attorney and suing law enforcement. I want to put this to bed right now. There is no systemic racism within law enforcement in this country, especially in democratic cities where people of color are running the cities.
No systemic racism. He says this having been a guy who has specifically sued law enforcement over and over again. He says no systemic racism at all. And then he brings in the clincher in Democrat-run cities. Next clip.
I would challenge the White House and my colleague to name me the town. Let's not just say the word. Name me the town, Harris. Name me the head of the department that is implementing a pattern and practice of racial discrimination against people of color. I want to be very clear. White House, Al Sharpton, Ben Crump, no systemic racism exists, and I challenge my colleague to give me the name of the town, the name of the police department, and the head of the department right now on national TV.
So he really put it to Biden. He put it to the White House. Was not able to get an answer from them. He put it to Geraldo. We'll look at Geraldo's response here in just a second. But Andrew, what do you think of this idea? It's one thing to say that okay, there is some residual racism. It is another to say that, man, there is just no systemic racism. Do you think Leo's right?
No, absolutely. I think that there's no question about this idea of residual racism, this idea that there are still folks, I mean, plenty of people we hear, reported frequently on Burgess Owens, someone who lived through, in his early years, Jim Crow. There are people who are in a population, in our population, who are old enough to remember actual structural and systemic racism. That's kind of the danger here, actually, is that this concept, these vague terms and definitions are very useful politically. The problem with them is that they don't stand up to the historical test. And when you have a historical test being put on in real time with people who were there, folks like Terrell, these people aren't willing to say that things haven't gotten better. And that really is the Democratic claim, is that things in the United States have gotten no better over the last 5, 6, 7 decades, and that's simply not true.
That's the brilliant part about the systemic racism gimmick, is that you don't have to see overt racism. You don't have to see individuals treating minorities poorly. All you have to do is see different outcomes for minorities versus majorities. And that's explained as racism. But Olivia, isn't it the case that there could be other causes for different outcomes as far as imprisonment rates, crime rates, drug rates, those sorts of things?
Yes, of course. And it's so important to know, it has to do with, family background is not exclusively race. It could be, your father or mother made more money. Maybe they were in the gold rush. You have no idea what sorts of, history has to do with that. It's not always race in which people get, we always hear the word privilege. But, it's really important to know in America that people, come from different countries just because they have the opportunity to build up a career, to build up a life, which really breaks down this whole idea of systemic racism when you have a person from Puerto Rico or something like that coming and being able to make a life.
Yeah, so that's an interesting thought. If we are just still wildly racist and just rotten to the core with systemic racism, as Olivia points out, why in the world do people keep immigrating here? If you're a minority, why in the heck are you going to immigrate here?
It's kind of the million-dollar question right now. It becomes even more so the million-dollar question when Democrats take office, because then, of course, you see these major immigration rushes, right? We have everyone spilling over into the country, and another thing the Democrats claim is that not only are we racist, we're xenophobic. We hate immigrants here in this country, is their claim at the very least. And so it becomes kind of a microcosm that the immigration debate can absolutely be seen as a way that we can kind of refute this nonsense about systemic racism in this country to date, because the non-white immigrants who are coming from South America would still rather be here than with the population of non-white Hispanic-born, Latino-born folks in their home countries. Clearly, this structural racism, if it exists at all, isn't compelling enough to say that the opportunity in America is outweighed. It is moot.
Yes, that's good. Tom Sowell, the economist the prolific economist, I think he's written over, I'm gonna be wrong with this. I think he's written over 80 books. Ultimately, he's written an unbelievable number of books. He is famous for doing studies that debunk the left's narratives on race and minorities and those things. One of the interesting things he looked at is it doesn't matter let's not break it down by race. Let's break it down by position in family. So it turns out firstborns tend to be. It's more likely that a firstborn is going to be a lawyer or a doctor than any of the other children in the family. Now, is that a result of families simply preferring the firstborn and not the others? As far as we can tell, parents love their children the exact same. And so Sowell makes the point: if we can't even figure out how to get equity in individual families, how in the world are we going to do it on a societal level? That's a really good question.
We could, as an only child, I would forward the claim that perhaps we should just have less people.
Yeah, well, that's exactly what an only child would say. A spoiled, wretched only child.
I'd also like to know, as the baby of the family, what they say about the last person born.
We'll have to ask Dr. Soul. I don't know off the top of my head. So this conversation continued between Terrell and Geraldo. Geraldo responded to it. Let's run that clip.
Go right ahead.
This subject is too important. I asked it right in front of you. Name me the town, name me the city. Then he goes and ignores the subject and wants to play the sympathy card.
Leo,
I'll ask you again because this is too important. No, don't do that, Geraldo. Don't do that because there's too many people on the left and yourself lying about systemic racism. Harris asked about systemic
Leo,
racism.
don't accuse me of lying just because I disagree with you, buddy.
Don't you disagree with us stepping over each other? Leo, go ahead and finish.
Oh, thank you, Harris. And all the viewers, ask Geraldo to name the police department and the city so we can get this systemic racism out. Because I'm sure there's a federal judge who's going to eliminate it. Name me the city and the town, Geraldo. You can't do it.
You want me to name you the top 10 cities? St. Louis, here in Cleveland, New Orleans. I can name you every one.
So for 1 second, because we're going to have to go, and I want to make sure I get this question in, Geraldo. So you have named those cities as Leo has asked. So are you saying that there's systemic racism to the point where you can paint with one brush all of those cops? Because I've lived in some of those places, and they're beautiful.
I lived there. They were great.
That sounds like 12 Angry Men.
Did you? Well, did you notice he mentioned St. Louis, Cleveland. He mentioned New Orleans, all Democrat-run cities. Yeah. What do we take from that, Olivia?
What I take from that is that Democrats need to be changing some of their policies based on seeing how their cities are being run to the ground.
Yeah. It's so interesting to me that the places that appear to transgress leftist values the most are the ones that are run by Democrats.
And the problem with that becomes then that the moment that the evidence is no longer in their favor, they're going to deflect every question out of the way. Geraldo is a fantastic example. He had just had this same argument with Bongino 2 weeks ago that resulted in a massive yelling match because Geraldo does exactly what the typical, and I don't want to, I don't want to paint with the same broad brush, but a typical leftist tends to come to the table with subjective arguments. For Geraldo, it's, well, I've been a reporter for decades in these cities, and I've seen what these cops do, and it's, well, does your experience as a singular reporter for a major news network really reflect accurately, and what you've seen really reflect accurately enough to just throw away the data?
So, that's exactly right. Terrell asked, and I don't know if you caught it, Terrell asked the best question there, where are these cities so that we can get rid of this racism? And that's the interesting thing, is they'll never tell you exactly where this is, except in America. It's embedded in America. That's really handy because what they want to do is get rid of America, and so that gives them grounds for it without ever having to perform.
And the enemies that they paint, the old white conservative enemies that they paint, no longer exist. So we have folks like Ben Shapiro has been making this point for a very long time. I'm with you. I hate racism. It's terrible. It's horrifying. It should be eradicated. It's an ideology that is unacceptable to hold and to hate another human being based upon race. Show me where the racists are, and we will fight them together. They will never give you the answer. It is always some vague, ethereal. Yep. Michael likes to use the word ethereal. It is ethereal. It's the perfect definition. There is never a specific response because a specific response would require that policy solutions be brought to the table.
The closest thing I can think of, and it is institutionalized, is affirmative action because that is a Democrat policy. It's a leftist policy, and it takes race into account. And in fact, it's hurting Asians at Harvard right now, or at least that's the claim that's before the courts. All right, so shifting from Leo and Geraldo and systemic racism, we're going to shift to Olivia and big tech. Olivia's been keeping an eye on a story over there that has to do with actually some pretty liberal or maybe even leftist app makers who are now coming out and kind of sounding a warning about big tech itself, and specifically Apple. Tell us about that.
Yeah, so I have a really interesting story today about taking down big tech. It is, like you said, interesting to see that these are liberal companies that were recently at a Senate subcommittee hearing. And so these companies are Tile, which helps with finding different It's a device that you can put on your keys if you lose them. Personally, I need one, not an endorsement of Tile.
Yeah, you can GPS your kids with it. You put it on their backpack
Yes.
and that stuff. Yeah. Got
So
it.
Tile is one of these groups. The other group is the Match group. That is home to both dating apps Tinder and Hinge. So those are very, very left-leaning. And in addition, Spotify, which is the world's largest music streaming place. And so all of these companies have come out for support of Black Lives Matter. Do you have the tweet showing everyone? So you can see here, Tile says, every voice counts. We stand with you. # Black Lives Matter. You can see also Tinder, Spotify, Hinge, all really saying the same thing, most of them with the same black background. So it's interesting to see that now they are going up against their fellow liberals, Apple and Google. So it's really, really important to know everything that they most recently said in the subcommittee hearing that they just had. So Spotify, you're good now. So Spotify said that Apple is abusing its complete power in ways that they are threatening others and different things like that. So they specifically said that Apple has threatened them in specific ways, such as in 2013, they threatened to shut them down completely. They also are alleging that they are prolonging updates that were very, very minor just to hurt Spotify.
Oh, they're delaying updates. So
They're
they can't
delaying
patch their
them.
software. Okay.
Yes, and they're withholding promotion within the App Store that Spotify, who wanted to speak out about this behavior, would not say anything. These are the things that Apple was retaliating and doing. This is what Spotify alleges that they did.
So Spotify's saying we've been a little bit critical of Apple, and now Apple's punishing us by not letting us update software, by not letting us promote our product in the marketplace, and that sort of thing. Okay, and so you've got these companies that have been pretty supportive of BLM. Presumably, they're on the left, and even they are warning that big tech is a problem. So, Andrew, I have been surprised that the Biden administration has continued to actually kind of pay attention to big tech, and not in a very positive way. And they don't need positive attention paid. They need to be scrutinized, and the Biden administration continues to. Do you think anything's going to come out of where on Biden's list of priorities do you think?
I wouldn't say it's particularly high. It's got to be middle of the pack at best. I would love to see it happen for a very, very long time. I think my, very particularly modern and young conservative values would have had me be, a free market proponent through and through. Over the last kind of few years, I've started to dig into Teddy Roosevelt, and I'm growing more and more convinced that the Section 230 claims, the idea that we should suddenly be able to sue our app makers and our tech companies for what is on their platform that they didn't produce, we should make that the case. We should take away their protections against lawsuit as a solution to what they've been doing and how they've been censoring conservatives. Yeah. I think that's a terrible solution. I think that's a deeply broken governmental solution, but I think antitrust is the way to go here. And I think that what these companies are learning and what they're bringing up, I'm hopefully Joe Biden will see this case being made and he'll take it up, is that they're learning that, maybe they thought that all these companies in Silicon Valley were all allies because we're all blue, we're all Democrats. Yeah. But they've kind of begun to realize, well, Apple, Facebook, and Google, the big ones, they care about one color more than blue and more about, their black or the color they care about green. And if that means that they need to keep other people out of the market by hijacking their software, by making them less competitive artificially on their own platforms, they'll do it, and they'll hurt anyone. They don't care as long as they make a little bit of money and make those gains. Hopefully Joe Biden is seeing that case being made. These are allies. These are left-wing folks. Yeah. He should be seeing that these companies have power that is equivalent to government power at this point in their sector of the marketplace.
It's also sort of the equivalent of all animals are equal, but some animals are more equal than others.
Yes,
you know, we're all we good fellows get together and run tech and make our apps and these things. But it turns out at the end of the day, really it's Apple and Google and Facebook, and you guys, go do your own thing. Just bow and scrape and whatever. That's an interesting comment you made about sort of your evolution there as far as conservative ideas go with this. I'm undergoing something similar right now, and a lot of free market folks and small government folks are hanging on, I think, unreasonably to the idea that, well, government just has no business being involved in this at all. Yeah. And no, conservatism should be about keeping government as small as is reasonable. Yes. But we don't think no government is the answer. We think that government should exist to restrain evil, and to act on behalf of all of us when action is required. And it does not seem that having, Facebook, Google, and Apple, I mean, those guys have got the monopoly on communication today. And it seems to me like this is the equivalent of in 1776, one big company owning all the paper, one big company owning all the ink, and one big company owning all the printing presses. Yep. Okay, yeah, everybody's kind of got free speech, sure, but how do you exercise? You can't exercise it in a practical way that's useful for society. So this is an enormous, enormous problem that government does need to address. And I'm kind of sick of hearing conservatives say, oh, well, just let the free market fix it. The government doesn't have any business interfering in this. Well, it turns out you want the government to interfere in things that are bad for society, right?
I would agree.
Yes.
Do you believe that big tech needs to be broken up? Me
personally?
Yeah.
I haven't decided what I think the solution to it is. I do think antitrust would probably be extraordinarily useful. Part of the problem is that big tech is so giant, its tentacles extend so far into every facet of life. It's very easy for talking heads and people on web shows and stuff to come out and advocate a position without thinking about the repercussions of the position and all the externalities associated with it. And so I don't know the answer. I do know that living in a society where a small group of people who all have essentially the same ideological view controlling, say, 90% of the ability to communicate, that is not healthy. Yeah. There's no argument for that being healthy. And government does exist to fix things where private individual action can't accomplish what is needed. So we've got to be thinking about it. And I think there are good people thinking about this. All right. Shifting, we've talked about systemic racism, talked about big tech. Now let's shift to the spiritual front. Andrew, you had a great opportunity to sit down with famed Christian author and apologist Lee Strobel. You guys talked a little bit about revival. You talked about some other things. Take us through, and I think we're releasing different pieces of this at different times. Take us through your piece here.
Yeah, absolutely. So we talked a little bit about apologetics, a little bit about the politicization of the church. We spoke about at length about the case for Christ. It's a 20-plus-year-old book at this point, but it is still just chock full of great material to discuss. But really, something that just floored me, and we'll get to it here in a second. I want to play the clip. But first, we got at the idea that America is becoming a less religious nation. We've seen time after time the polls, particularly I favor Gallup. I think they're a pretty decent polling institution as far as polling goes, has shown month after month, year after year, that we're seeing church membership decline, we're seeing church attendance decline, we're seeing all these problems. I mean, just last year we saw that church membership sunk below 50%. That has been a conversation in the conservative circle as long as I've been alive, even before I was a Christian. And it was something that, even as a just traditional conservative, I thought, this is probably a negative thing. It will result, whether you are a Christian or not, in a depletion of conservative values because religiosity leads to conservative principle. Mm-hmm. So it's been something where, it's been kind of a chicken little sky is falling scenario. I guess what I want to ask you guys is, what do you think the implications of a post-religious society are of this sort of massive decline in religiosity? What are the implications of that on American culture?
Well, you've seen a lot with just recently. We're seeing, decline in homes. We're seeing teen pregnancies on the rise, still considerably. Abortions on the rise. This is when the church is not in people's homes. It's very, very important that, if the parent, is working, maybe they aren't with them as much either. And the church has this place in the home to be able to teach children as well, different biblical principles. We've been seeing all the riots, all the looting, stealing. In the Bible, it's very clear, showing you do not steal, you do not lie. All these basic principles that the Bible teaches, we're seeing a moral decay.
Yeah, moral decay for sure. And we have had. I don't think it's unusual for the United States. We had a cultural touchstone, which was Christianity, essentially. And whether you were a small C Christian or a big C Christian, you tended to at least appreciate the values and broadly acknowledge their validity and usefulness. As that has withdrawn, as people have left that, you're then left with the question of sort of what's going to motivate your life, what's going to govern your life. Dennis Prager had a great piece on this. I think it was yesterday. If you go to westernjournal.com, you should be able to pull it up. He was talking about something similar, how normally you get meaning in your life from raising a family, providing for a family, your faith, and patriotism. Yep. Those are normally, I think those are the four that he listed. And we see the American public retreating on all of those fronts. That's an enormous problem, because once you lose purpose, what tends to take over is nihilism. Mm-hmm. Now, you lose purpose, then you may go out and have a little bit of fun. You may think, okay, there are no consequences, so I'm going to go out and I'm going to sleep with whomever I want, and I'm going to lead my life however I want. It turns out that's actually pretty destructive, and the end result of that is nihilism, where you essentially don't believe in much of anything. And the problem with that is, if you don't believe in much of anything, the only thing real anymore is pain. And then you begin to make the calculation, well, if life is mostly pain, or if it's more pain than pleasure, I'm probably better off not living. I can't remember if you and I were talking about this. I think that is a reason you see these memes talking about how it's only white men who commit mass shootings. Now, based on the FBI definition, that's not true. There are black men who do it too. Yes. However, the really big number shootings, turns out a lot of those guys are white. Yes. And I think what's happening is, for most reasonably affluent Americans, there's nothing left to fight for. You've got satellite technology in your pocket, and you have access to the world's knowledge. You're not going to be hungry. You can go get sex on the internet or in Nevada if you want it, or whatever the case may be. Whether the narrative on systemic racism and oppression of blacks is true or not, it is believed by a lot of people in the black community, and that gives them something to fight against. They do have a reason to exist. And I think what we're seeing as Christianity retreats, nihilism is taking over, and people who normally would have purpose do not have purpose anymore. I think there's a reason antidepressant prescriptions are so high, anti-anxiety prescriptions are so high. I take medicine for both of those things. I'm not a nihilist, but without Christ, I would be. Yeah. I think so. Yeah, it's deadly. It's deadly.
Absolutely. So I would have held that exact same opinion, and I still, I think, Mr. Strobel absolutely felt the same way given our conversation. I still feel that way, but he had a really unique take that he brought to the table that I kind of wanted to show to you guys. So for our audience at home, we're going to play that clip right now.
And so we're seeing that more and more people don't seem to kind of buy into this. The polls are showing that there is kind of a major lapse in the religiosity here in the West and in the United States in particular. I mean, what kind of comes with that? We see people like, I don't know if you're familiar with Jordan Peterson, not a Christian, but speaks tremendously on the idea that when people lose value in these important institutions and these important truths, these objective matters, they start to find value in these subjective things that create kind of a danger to the society and kind of create a kind of really flawed architecture for the way that we move. Yeah. Can you just speak to that at all?
Yeah, I think that that's exactly true. I'm not so sure that all of it is negative. when we looked at the change in so-called religiosity of Americans, church attendance, for instance, as is measured, and we're not losing people who are truly committed. We're losing people who may identify as a Christian, but they're not really a Christian. And so those are the kind of folks who are falling away. So I don't think we're necessarily losing people who are committed and knowledgeable about the Christian faith. Now, that makes it a challenge for us who want to see people come to faith. How do we reach those people? But I don't think it's necessarily unhealthy for people to realize, you know what, I've been kind of playing the Christian game. I'm not really a Christian. Well, that's probably a good realization to come to. Great, now let me help you understand what it means to really be a follower of Jesus.
So incredibly unique take there. We have heard, like I said, the conservative media, the Christian media has been sky is falling on this issue for many years now, at least a decade now, probably more. A very unique take. He said that, the decline in religiosity is, quote, exactly true, but went on to add that it may not all be negative. So I want to ask you guys, I want to forward to you guys, would you agree with that it is good that we're seeing essentially folks who are lukewarm believers being jarred out of that, and maybe we get a chance to kind of clean slate, bring it back to them again, evangelize them again, and get them truly committed to the faith?
I do think it's encouraging. It's a great perspective that I had not thought of before. And when we were talking about this before the show, when you were telling me about it, the first thing I thought of was right before the First Great Awakening in the States. The church, a generation or two earlier, had passed what they called the halfway covenant. And essentially what it said was, well, if you've got a family member who's a member of the church, you can be a member of the church too. That resulted in church roll swelling, but an influx of secularism and non-believers in the church. The Great Awakening, all of a sudden, those folks realized, oh gosh, I'm not a believer. And I had a pastor who said, it's the bad news that makes the good news good. You got to get lost before you can get saved.
Yep.
And as folks leave, that does set them up to then realize, oh, well, wait a minute, maybe I did not have this. I can't remember if it's in James or I think 1 John where he says, talking about people like this, he says, they went out from us because they weren't of us. If they had been of us, they wouldn't have gone out from us, but they did. So they weren't. That is a really encouraging way to think of this. And to the extent that it might parallel some of the circumstances of the First Great Awakening, that's super encouraging to me.
Yeah, and I would like to see, right now also with COVID, that could be part of it. People, it's harder to track the membership of the church when someone's watching from home. I frequently watch from home. I go when I'm in town, but if I'm traveling, I go out and watch church. You can't really figure out the whole membership of a church when someone's watching online. So you always have to take that into account as well. However, I do believe, we have seen this steady decline. I do, always see an opportunity for more people to come back after there is a low. We want to go back up on a high. It's just exactly, up and down through life. So I definitely believe that we are going to have a point where more people will be coming back to the church.
Yeah. It's good stuff. Thank you, fellas.
Thank you.
Ladies. Thank you. We appreciate you taking time out of your afternoon to sit here and visit with us. We're so grateful for you. Thank you also for supporting the Western Journal and checking out. You can see the stories we've talked about here there. If they're not up yet, they're going to be because we're in the process of working on them right now. That is going to do it for us today. Remember, we are here every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 5 p.m. Eastern, 2 p.m. Pacific on WJ Live. Remember, if you're watching us on YouTube, click the subscribe button. After you click the subscribe button, a little bell is going to come up. If you click that bell, that'll make sure you get notified every time we go live. You've heard about shadow banning. One of the things that shadow banning means is you don't get notified when people go live or when they post new stuff. Click on that bell. That'll make sure that you get notified when we go live. Additionally, if you'd like to support us past viewing and reading articles over at the Western Journal, if you'd like to support us in more direct ways, you can always go to westernjournal.com/join. westernjournal.com/join. There are several options there for ways you can partner with us to help us fight for the truth and get it out. At the end of the day, that is the most important thing. We appreciate you partnering with us and helping us do that. Thank you. We're going to see you again Friday. Have a nice afternoon.